Hello, welcome to this webinar today, which is one of our normal webinars where we discuss some of the issues of our present century. One of the interesting things clearly about this present century is the growth of social media and the digital revolution. And we ask many questions about that, on how it affects our lives in general, but particularly how it affects our politics. And that's what we're going to look at in this webinar. What is the relationship between social media and politics? And in this webinar, we're going to be talking to Elizabeth Bailey, who has always been interested in how people talk about politics on social media and the impact that might have. And Elizabeth, I know, is doing and has done a PhD on this and has done quite a lot of research and a lot of interviews of people around this particular issue. So let's go over to Elizabeth now, who'll give her presentation, and I hope you'll ask your questions and make your comments. And then Fong Skovgaard will lead the facilitation, will question Elizabeth and put your questions to her. So over to Elizabeth now, and thank you for doing this.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining me. Before I call up my presentation, I just wanted to say thank you for coming here to listen to some of my ideas and my research and development. And I'm really interested to hear your own views on this. I hope you find it interesting. The slide set I'm about to show you is a bit academic looking. It looks a bit dry, but don't worry, because actually the topic itself is quite fascinating, and it's based on speaking to a lot of people around the country. So it's not a theoretical project at all. It's very, very much a hands-on one. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what I'm doing, and this sounds a little bit dry. It's the work I've been doing for my PhD research, and I'm in the last year of a PhD, I hope, or certainly in the last 18 months. And I've been looking at people's lived experience of talking about politics on social media. And it's a phenomenographic study, and that means it's actually, I'm asking people for their views on their experience from their own perspective. I'm interested in how they see it, because there's a lot of opinions, academic opinions, about what's happening to people and what's happening to politics because of social media that don't ask people for their own views. So just a little bit about me very quickly. I used to be a civil servant, so I used to work in Whitehall for about 20 years. I now work in local government while I'm studying. My background's in press and publicity offices, and that's relevant because I've got a lot of experience of working in government, and I understand the role that media plays in that. But as a civil servant, I always had to be politically neutral, and since a few years since I left this civil service, I've become more involved in political activity, mainly to do with public health, which is my day job. And I'm involved in lobbying for charities, principally Cancer Research UK. And I was very involved in the standardised packaging campaign. I'm working with my PhD supervisor, John Silverman. If you're of a certain age, you might have remembered him from the BBC. He used to be a Home Affairs correspondent. I've been interviewing people all around the country about their experiences. So that's what I'm going to talk about. To go through this very quickly, I'm particularly interested in the intersection of media and government and politics and public community generally. And I've always been really interested in how ordinary people talk about politics. Just from my own background, my father was a member of the Labour Party through his trade union, but my mum was a working class Tory. So I grew up with people arguing about politics. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that they find it so difficult. And I've got a quote here from an academic from the University of Colorado. He says, "Perhaps the most striking feature of the subject of politics is how prone it is to disagreement. Only religion and morality rival politics as a source of disagreement. This should strike us as very odd. So why is it so difficult? Never talk about religion or politics. Now, if you go online and watch people talk about politics, you'll see that it becomes really, really difficult and combative at times. It's not an easy environment in some places. As my background's a civil servant, obviously I'm concerned about the way people reach consensus about things we need to do for government. So it's important to me. For many decades, there's been a lot of discussion about people's disengagement from politics, and that it's inauthentic. And there's been a lot of talk about new movements, and people pin their hopes on things, visions of individuals and parties. What's interesting to me is a lot of this conversation is increasingly being generated online. And a lot of people have views about that as they're either pessimistic or optimistic. So I'm interested to the extent in which either perspective is justified. It's also a massive collective text. It's a huge collective text. If you look at texts throughout history, the evidence we have from past civilizations, it's quite scant. But now we have an enormous amount of information about ourselves. We have an enormous amount of information about how we talk about politics. And that's fascinating to me. What does it all mean? And how on earth do we go about exploring it? As somebody who's works in practical day-to-day government, I think that understanding our strengths and weaknesses operating in this environment can help us envisage ways to self-educate ourselves and be more politically effective, I hope. My research objectives are to add to the body of knowledge on political participation. If you've got an interest in political science, you know there's a lot of research into why people participate, how they do and how they behave. And I want to gain a deeper understanding of the subjective meaning of informal online political expression. So not formal establishment politics, but the way people chat about politics in their ordinary environments. And most importantly, I want to understand it from their own perspective. So I've asked these particular questions, and I've gone around the country and I've talked to lots of people. I've done lots of individual interviews, and I've done one focus group and doing another soon. And I also spend a lot of time watching people's political conversation online. So I'm asking the questions: how do users of social media evaluate their participatory role in UK political events? And just at this point, I should say that I'm focusing on the UK because I'm interested in how this works in an established democracy. Obviously, social media has been very important in things like the Arab Spring and in less established democracies and major events around the world, but I'm interested in its function within an established democracy. I'm interested in how people see the relationship between their online activity and real life political outcomes. I mean, you come on Global Net 21 and you're very, very interested in policy matters and politics. What do you think your discussion here, what bearing does it have on political outcomes? It obviously does, but sometimes it's slightly convoluted, so that's interesting. And lastly, I'm interested in what people think the value and meaning of online political discussion is, both from their own perspective and from the perspective of others. It could be said that certain events wouldn't have happened without social media. UKIP, for example, has relied almost entirely on social media to reach the position it did before the referendum, the EU referendum. Jeremy Corbyn has very much relied on social media because he's had a bit of a rough rap from the mainstream media, that's for sure. And he's also, that side of the party, the Labour Party, is, again, like UKIP, it didn't have a lot of money to spend on more expensive forms of communications. So I'm really interested in people's behaviour in this environment, and these surge phenomena are the kind of things that led to, like, the EU referendum result. And I'm interested in what underlies their behaviour, because if they say something like they support Nigel Farage or Jeremy Corbyn or anybody else, it's possible they're saying quite a lot of complicated things about their own identity and their own emotions. And I'm also interested in what the convoluted effects are. And I think there's a lot of interesting things underlying this. I have been asking people in particular about major recent events, which were the Scottish referendum in 2014, the ongoing debate around the Labour Party leadership, the EU referendum and the related surge in UKIP, and the 2017 general election. And there's a lot of correlation with changing demographics, the rise of identity politics, and a lot of people who haven't previously been engaged or haven't recently been engaged in political debate. So I've just got some images there from social media political discussion, some of which is highly entertaining, and some of which is a bit scary. I love these two from Twitter, because we had so many major events in short succession. It just, if you're interested in politics, it was just like Christmas, all your Christmases at once. Clearly, there's a clear correlation between the growth of emergent political events and groupings and the growth of online and social media. We've mentioned UKIP, we've mentioned Jeremy Corbyn. What the causative relationships are not so clear, and are not just about macro political forces, but I think, and others do, that they're also about some very visceral aspects of the way that we interact, and social media shines a very bright light. That's imaging of the brain of somebody being challenged about their political view. It shows the regions of the brain that light up when somebody disagrees with your profound views on politics. We know from experience that we know from experience that people will often discount evidence, clear evidence that challenges their political beliefs, because we tend to hypotheses. And it's also pretty well understood that a lot of people, we pick a team and we look for the evidence afterwards. And you can probably see that a political debate about a polarised matter like Scottish independence, for example. But there's a lot of stuff concerned about what's going on in our brain when that happens. But it is a very visceral experience, because when we have strongly held things, it's difficult for us when somebody challenges them. It's very difficult. And people deal with that in different ways in an online debate situation. So I make some reference to that. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm interested in the information and ideas that underpin that kind of understanding of the issue. I've also pulled on a lot from 20th century sociology, and these are, for example, symbolic interactionism, which is we react to what other people think of us. This is very crudely put. We react to what we think other people think of us. So it is in our head of what we are seeing, and we react to that. So we react to symbols in a way. That's quite important, because a lot of what we understand of politics, a confection. We don't know Jeremy Corbyn, we don't know Nigel Farage personally, we know them through the media, most of us. Irving Goffman, very interesting, ideas about the presentation of self, that we construct a dramaturgical, in social situations, we present ourselves in a certain way, it's constructed. Ideas on the definition of situation, that we enter certain situations with an agreed definition of what it is. We know how we should behave at a wedding or in a courtroom. And in many political situations, we do. Psychological situationism is about how your personality isn't fixed, but it's different in different situations. And you can see it online. You can see people who are really nice in the pub or in church or mosque or wherever else they go, and they get online, they're really rude. What's happened there? And the last one is performativity. And in linguistics, it's the idea that certain types of language perform a function. So if you say, I now pronounce you husband and wife, or husband and husband, or whatever, that's a performative statement. But Judith Butler said that language is also performative in that it describes our identity. It helps tell people about our identity. And so when people go online and talk about politics, they're telling you often about their identity. They're saying, I'm anti-racist, or I'm patriotic, or any number of things that they'd like to see themselves as. So that's some of the theoretical background. Don't want to go on too long. I won't go through all the literature, but there's quite a lot of interesting literature I can let people know about afterwards. So it's the themes and issues I've been looking at are to what extent the social media shapes behaviour, or we shape it. It's about the simple and practical opportunities offered by technology. Really importantly, the role played by emotion and other visceral factors, and in my interviews that's really come across really strongly. How we consume information from the media, how distorted our view of politics is through social media, whether Facebook's more important than Twitter. I think it is, and I'm happy to discuss that. People's bad behaviour, some of you are interested in that, and polarisation. How's that supported by social media? And efficacy, really, surges versus sustainability. So when I go and talk to people, I ask these sort of questions. I ask about their level of participation, both in offline and online politics. I ask about their very subjective experience of online political discussion. I ask about it in relation to those major events I mentioned. I ask them about whether they see it as an expression of identity. And I ask them the big questions about whether they think it makes a difference and how, and if they've ever had their mind changed. And I ask supporting questions about how they consume media, because that's quite interesting in relation to social media as a channel for other media. And then I ask them about their own observations of this experience. One thing I found, online political discourse is about an awful lot more than straight establishment politics. There is a thing that Kaplan described as rational irrationality. And what he means by that is that some topics are too big for us to really get a grip on. And the EU referendum is a classic example. Who could really understand all the implications of that? So we tend to use heuristics and say, well, I think this and I go for this. So he's saying we're rationally irrational. It's too much effort to really know all of what's going on. Do social media channels mainly affect pre-political behaviour? Ideas formation, the way we develop our political views through debate and so on, rather than the formal aspect of political participation. What's their role in issues of identity and self-definition? I think very important, actually. What do we think about this very combative environment? Chantal Mouffe, who's a Marxist academic, believes that agonistic public spheres are essential, that we should be having rigorous debates about things. But is agonistic the same as antagonistic? We've talked about sustainability, and we've also mentioned people's gradual political education and ideas formation, which is, to me, is quite interesting. So, as I say, I've done focus groups and quite a few interviews. I'm still going on with those, monitoring discussion groups and data sources. I did do a short-lived study before the EU referendum of a number of UKIP pages, but in particular, And funnily enough, I was one of the few people who predicted the result because I've been watching this stuff for weeks. So it can give you, if you're interested in polling and so on, it can give you a lot of qualitative information, which is worthwhile having. So I'd like to go and speak to you soon, but just to give you a very quick insight into what I've found. People have told me some very interesting things. I went to Alloa in Scotland, and I met a lot of SNP supporters and some Scottish Labour Party supporters, and they had really embraced social media as a way of getting to grips with the referendum, but they had a lot of interesting ideas about its role. The most enriching thing I think so far has been the individual interviews I've undertaken. People have told me such personal stories. One of the questions I ask is, have you ever fallen out with family and friends over politics? And I've heard some extraordinary stories. I'll just tell you two. One was a woman who was adopted at birth and met her birth mother for the first time after 35 years. And they established a relationship, and it was great. And they fell out over Brexit. So there you go. And the other one was, I interviewed a lady who was a psychotherapist, and she said the most unusual thing happened. In the week of the EU referendum, every single one of my clients brought the EU referendum into the consulting room. It's never happened with any other topic, but they all wanted to talk about it in psychological terms. So I just thought that was very interesting. There was a lot more of that kind of very personal information. Discussion group observations, I see people forming camps, polarizing, taking sides, and often, it's a hard thing to say, being ineffective, doing the wrong thing, being rude to each other when they need to persuade. So it's interesting. People don't understand their own habits, behaviours and cognitive biases very well. Why should they? Well, they don't. So those are the interesting things I have found. Very quickly, I think I can say people value social media as a discussion ground, but they're divided about whether it's a good thing. There's clear evidence that people seek out echo chambers and find them, and they find it emotionally very hard to deal with opposing views, and that's contributed to big surprises like Brexit. Social media allows us to observe live in real time some of the unhelpful habits and cognitive biases that impact on the effectiveness of online debate. Our emotions and unconscious drivers are really important, but there are very low levels of awareness and understanding of the effects these might have. Things like backfire effect. If you lecture somebody, you push them away, that kind of thing. So because of these things, social media potentially offers us a real-time learning ground. It's sociologically very, very interesting, but there's a lot of things to work through. So there you go. I hope I didn't totally bamboozle you there. I'm going to turn this down. I'd be quite interested to hear if anybody has any views on that.
Yes. One of the questions I had, Elizabeth, is how can we avoid the spin and the private agendas of the establishment, the mainstream media? The BBC have been awful in the last couple of years on that side of things. And that gruesome correspondent, Laura Sillyberg, seems to think she's running the country and the politicians have to do what she wants them to do, or else she gets nasty. How do we avoid that? How do we allow ordinary people to understand what's going on, to inform themselves neutrally?
People have been using social media with that purpose, and if your views are, and I know that I know a lot of people I've spoken to that have similar views, and certainly when I went to Scotland, there was an awful lot of hostility towards the BBC in particular. And in those cases, people have taken to social media to share more information that reflects their own views. And that's clearly been going on. And at the last election, although when you say the mainstream media, the main newspapers and some broadcast media had, clearly some titles have a clear conservative bias, like the Mail. There's no, can't deny that. Social media on the whole was overwhelmingly supporting Jeremy Corbyn. So clearly people have taken that route.
Now, Peter, would you like to speak more about this? Or
well, one of the things that is quite bothersome is the way that Facebook actually works and deep inside itself, as far as we can ascertain. And one of the things it's designed to do is to put you in an echo chamber with people that believe the same things that you do, have similar interests to you, the ones that they can detect about you. But I'm a more complicated person than that, and I'm sure you are too, where some of my interests you might not discover or discern in what I do on Facebook, because I have a very wide circle of friends internationally, and because of that we're able to debate contentious issues as a debate where we can learn from each other by discussing things with people from a different tribe or whatever it might be. I'm a great believer in the learning opportunities afforded.
Me too.
Social media tends towards a mob rule methodology in general, and piling in with the herd is seen to be cool, and resisting the herd can get you trolled up, down and sideways, as I have been in the past, especially on the subject of Trump. I was just recently invited to go to the States, and I'm not going, A, because I can't stand it, what it's become, and B, because I won't be let through border security, no doubt, with what I've said. So that, it's not that I'm a coward, it's just I don't need the hassle. So the mob rule thing bothers me, the echo chambers bother me, and I don't see yet the realization of how productive social media could be as distinct from how it is at this moment.
About the echo chamber thing, the point I'm making is that you can break an echo chamber easily, and a number of I would say, and it's a difficult, I have to say this carefully, but perhaps the better informed, better educated people I've interviewed do read from sources that oppose their own political views. And you can break your echo chamber by following those different sources. So what I'm saying is that the psychological, our cognitive bias that lead us towards things like confirmation bias and so on, those habits of mind, and those often quite hardwired things you have to beat, are leading people into echo chambers. And to some extent, if people understood those things better, they might reflect on what they were doing. But it's very difficult, because I've spoken to people, they were very nice, but they found it physically difficult to be in the company of people who disagreed with them. They defriended them, they unfollowed them. They just couldn't deal with it. And you can say, this is an echo chamber, this is confirmation bias, this is all of these things, but they just can't cope. They can't cope. Physically, they can't cope.
Evan had a really good question in the chat.
I've tried in the past to try and get left-wingers and right-wingers to talk and debate about how they develop their views, and trying to unhook it from maybe their early life. But in general, one can't do that.
It's very difficult.
Very difficult. The impact of the internet on politics is a huge concern and a huge interest.
Yes.
There's a new professor of, I think it's called the Internet and Politics at Oxford. And he was interviewed by people from Cambridge. If you listen to the podcast Talking Politics from Cambridge, he has some very interesting things to say. Generally, the view is that the social media and all the things you do on the internet is very bad for democracy. It's not good for democracy. And we really need, I mean, what's really lacking is our platforms where you can have more, which are more deliberative than the existing ones, which really encourage good discussion and conversation, maybe facilitated in some way. And I think that we really should be pushing for those sort of things where people can have, bring in their views where the fear they're going to be sworn at and shouted at. And we really should, create a platform that allows us to do that.
But there's a school of thought that says that's hegemonic. That civilized debate is something that's it's a culturally particular thing, and some people take the view that their anger is justified, and they don't want to be civilized about their circumstances, and that's a school of thought. Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of things like the anger and things like the Black Lives Matter, the people who took that forward have strong belief in that their anger is justified, and they don't want to have polite debate. I'm not saying all the people in that movement think like that, but there are parts of that. So yes, a polite deliberative environment is a good thing to have, but it's not what everybody wants.
Well, for me, that's very sad, I must say, and it probably harks back to the way that we've been educated
correct,
and probably not taught to think reasonably. But that's another big topic. I think that we should always try and be polite to one another under these discussions. I mean, one of the things about politics, they consider very complex issues. Like you say, the EU, the Brexit, about all sorts of very complicated things. And it's really people's ego that comes up, I think, and somehow they feel they have to express a view, rather than saying this is so complicated that I really almost have to duck out of this decision-making process and leave it to people who are much, much better informed than me. But that isn't the case, obviously, because most people are asked to vote. So I think our whole political system, the democratic system, is deeply flawed. And so,
well, it's got people in it, and people are flawed. I mean, that's the bottom line. People have varying levels of education and varying levels of interpersonal skills and varying abilities, don't they? I mean, ultimately, you have people in the system who have far lower skill levels.
Yeah. I would take them out of the political system, but that's another. You must have people, I think, who are rational and reasonable. I come back. I don't come back by introducing this idea of sortition, where you essentially go to the politicians, and this is a topic I'm particularly interested in. But that's another matter. But the internet, I think, is proving to be a very valuable, a very poor instrument for enhancing good political debate. And I think it needs a very, very serious look at in that respect.
What do you think could be done about that?
I don't know. It could be almost a collapse of democracy if we're not careful. I mean, listen to what the bloke at Oxford has to say about this. He is just about optimistic that something good may come out of this. But we really must start thinking very carefully. I think this setting up of moderated platforms for discussion on complex political issues is urgent. And I mean, Twitter and Facebook, I mean, they're almost the opposite to that. And so, but that's a big job. There's this Tremor platform that Francis is using on GlobalNet 21, which probably is better, but it's still not particularly good. I think somehow we've got to really, really work hard to try and create a new platform. That'd be a massive job for someone or for an organisation.
Yeah.
Sorry, even.
Sorry.
No, I'm just thinking what we are doing in GlobalNet 21. It is we are having a platform to discuss, like you are talking about, very politely, and quietly and
which is
discuss
good.
our different meanings. But
Yes.
what kind of platform are you thinking of? Are you thinking of the same kind of like Facebook, big and complex but polite?
Yeah, probably. I mean, internet-based platform, and it's got a huge number of advantages because you can talk to so many people, of course. So I think that needs to be that. But a lot of more local groups, like well, France is. I mean, the Global Net 21 isn't necessarily local. I mean, because we can access anyone from around the world to contribute. But I don't know the answers to this. But I do know that the current systems, I think, are very dangerous for a democratic system, and very dangerous in the way we vote in elections. Hugely dangerous, and that's been proven to be the case with Trump. I'm not necessarily saying Trump's a bad man, but he did use political media in a very, very clever way, such to persuade people to vote for him.
True, but there's all manner of effects, and Jeremy Corbyn, for example, the last election result was, I mean, he made a big dent, and a lot of that was observably, I think, because of a building of a social media following.
Yeah, and Bernie Sanders also in the States, that was another phenomenon. But that's whereby that was I think a lot of local activity, not internet generated, but a lot of local activity where people were then going out and getting people to do this. But Jeremy Corbyn won because his opponent screwed up big time.
I mean, one of the things that concerns me is there's a lot of robotic generated activity, and there's a lot of stuff from Russia and so on, and it's difficult for people who aren't media literate to spot half the time. It's difficult for a lot of us to spot.
Yeah, and the company called Cambridge Analytica, who had a big say in Farage and also in Trump, and are extremely, extremely dangerous to the democratic process.
I think that's a big concern. And we've got to do politics a whole lot differently, I think. But this is something which is, this is obviously ongoing.
The global net perspective, Evan, is that we're prepared to discuss anything with anybody, no matter their point of view, and see if we can reach an agreement, or if we can learn from each other, or something positive can come out of it. But that's global net. That's not the generation out there at the moment.
Yes. But I mean, we're a select group in a way, and probably not very representative, unfortunately.
No, but that's the whole point. If it works, then maybe we have to do something about it to make it bigger, to make people use it and learn from it.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah. So because a lot of people are enjoying being part of this. Michelle, she has a question. A comment for you, Evan.
For me, I see social media as an evolution of the system that we already had. People were in echo chambers with the newspapers they bought. People were in echo chambers with the programs they watched on television. And if you go back and research newspapers and identities and local papers 100 years ago, people were in echo chambers, and they were presented with establishment views, with information that didn't bear reality with the facts. And we have the same symptom now with the internet. It's just the same system. So the fault is not necessarily with social media. The fault is, as I see it, with our ability to discuss right from being small at school, our ability to engage in information that is from many different walks of life and be presented with that and discuss rather than just learning facts. And that's something that we need to do quite quickly.
I agree on that. I think that's very good. What you need to do is to transform education.
Yes.
It just happens that, you know, that Francis and I are putting on 4 transform education events in Conway Hall this year, because I believe that these sort of things are now very much to the fore in educating our children to live in this world now.
My friend Howard Rheingold has a very good book called Net Smarts, and in that is a whole section on what he terms crap detection. He taught that as a course in Stanford University as a professor, and you can find it online. But his key point really behind it all is that the education system is churning out people designed for last century, not for this century.
Absolutely.
In what respect?
Because they're taught to fit into the system. You know, they're taught the wrong sort of skills. They're not given skills in how to think for themselves, how to work things out for themselves, how to cross-check stuff that's thrust at them even from a teacher. And to say, well,
do you think that's absolutely true across the board?
I think it is.
Yeah.
As a broad generalization, Elizabeth, I'm sure there must be exceptions.
Yeah. No, education is really has a big role to play, I think, in this respect, and it needs to be turned around.
Is it to do? I mean, is it? I would think, but you know, I'm willing to be challenged. There's a complicated cause and effect system there, because the children who come from homes where there's not a lot of thought and discussion, it's hard for schools to rectify that. They're fighting against a lot, but it's a vicious cycle, because how do you address it?
But you have to break the circle. Ultimately, you get children probably at the age of 3 or 5 or whatever, and start teaching them to think critically and to think independently. And it will take several generations before that feeds through. But you can't give up, because people will always be born into dysfunctional families. And I think there's a chance of turning that round. And I think you have to get a good education system that does that. But this is, I believe, this is absolutely key to a lot of the things that the way we live on this planet now.
I also believe in people are born. Some people are born to discuss, and some people are born not to discuss. You know, they don't find it very easy to discuss, to argue.
Most people are bored by politics. They're not interested. And it's incredibly difficult to. We've got to really get children to be excited about the prospects of living a life on the planet. Genuinely excited.
You say most people are bored by politics, but actually the evidence suggests otherwise. And I mean, one piece of evidence is that the second fastest growing take-up of subject at universities is politics. You know, if students are going to politics wholesale, and the traffic on Facebook, politics is the biggest thing. It's actually bigger than cats.
Oh, right.
So I think what the issue is not that people aren't interested in politics, but they're disengaged from establishment politics. I think is the thing. And social media offers easy opportunities, like signing a petition that don't require too much commitment.
Yeah, I worry about their real engagement. I think they feel helpless that they can do anything. I mean, you can persuade some of them to come out and vote once every 5 years, but if you ask them to do that twice in 4 years, they say they start getting bored. So I think it's back to education and getting people interested in the way we live on this planet. I think that should be fundamental, particularly as things are likely to change in the future quite a lot.
Yep. To link up to Hannah's in the chat, by the way.
Can I ask you, one of the articles in the news in the past fortnight has been the story about Diane Abbott and the phenomenal amount of abuse she has received. I've watched an awful lot of abusive material on Facebook. Her experience is quite singular, but other people will get it too. Do you have any feelings about where that comes from?
No, I'm amazed that people do this. I have to say, and I've also been in receipt of comical stuff. You know,
Really?
it's unbelievable that people do this. And this is something, again, where I believe ultimately we've got to start, you know, teaching people that this is an essentially unacceptable behavior. And they wouldn't, it doesn't lead to real, and any sort of harmony that we might have on the globe. And I think we must start really thinking about these sort of things. But I agree, it's appalling. Why, as soon as they get in front of a keyboard, they feel, and they're sort of anonymous, but not always, that they can say what the hell they like. It staggers me.
Because on the internet, nobody knows you're an idiot.
Oh, but they do. No, it is interesting. And what psychological, I'm not a neuroscientist, but what process is going on where people think it's different, the situation is different, and they can behave in a way they don't in others. I've lost count of the times people have said to me in interviews, "You'd never speak like that to somebody in a pub." Of course you wouldn't, because after a couple of drinks they'd clock you on. But
this is exactly what you should be sourcing and endeavouring to understand. Because you're right in the middle of this. You know, you're studying how people develop their views, why they develop very strong views, and often, you know, can be very bolshy in what they type and what they maybe say. Now, this is the topic of your PhD thesis. So it'd be very nice to hear. I should be delighted when you eventually come up with your conclusions and you ask some, you know, intelligent comment on this. And then what the hell can we do about it?
There was a funny.
That's the end game, isn't it? It's these are people struggling to overcome impulses they find hard to keep in. And education is clearly part of that, but the other things need to happen, I guess, as well.
As far as the use of shaming is concerned, I remember a wonderful put down in the 1990s on the Well, which was the first place where social media started, you could say. And somebody said something completely ridiculous. And one of the wise wizards opened one eye and delivered of himself 2 lines using shaming. And what he said was, "Thank you for sharing that." And then the next line read, "Please don't breed." Very true.
You read some actually very funny stuff. I mean, it's a very rich text. I find it fascinating because some of the put-downs are very, very funny.
I mean, if these real debates could be facilitated in some way for someone who's very skilled, who can really find the humour in almost everything, to get people, and I think if you get humour into discussion, it really helps things go along.
Totally agree.
Yes.
Totally agree.
So we've got to get someone that I mean, these are the conclusions, I hope, Elizabeth, that you may come up with something along these lines.
I wish I knew the answer.
Get people laughing, you can get a good distance.
Yeah.
Michelle, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think put downs and bullying or being negative on the internet, because it is at a distance, then people don't feel the consequences that they would normally feel in a face-to-face interaction or a group interaction. So teaching people the consequences of their sometimes ridiculous behavior, I think, is really important. And also helping them to see that transient, because they might feel it's transient. When you click a like on something, you even forget what you liked a few days later. And did I read that? Was I there? But that transient could be very painful to the person receiving the barrage of negative information. And people need to understand that, and I don't think that's taught clearly enough. I know at schools and at secondary education, teachers have information in classes to help children deal with bullying online, but I don't think there's enough information towards those that would tend to bully on the effects that they're having on others. And if they were helped to see that and understand that, I think it would help each other a lot more, so that you're more prepared for this information that comes at you. Yeah. it's very simple. It all boils down to education.
Well, it is and it isn't, I think. And one point I would make is I've interviewed somebody with an autistic spectrum disorder. I've interviewed somebody who had been recently bereaved. I've interviewed somebody who's had a serious mental health problem, and each of those people said that actually they found it difficult to modify their expression. One, because that's a characteristic of an ASD. The second, because they were emotionally very overwrought. And the third, because they'd had mental health problems and they had difficulty reacting to things in ways one would think were rational or whatever. So, yes, people need to understand the effect they're having on others who might be vulnerable. But sometimes people express themselves poorly because of things they can't necessarily help. It's one thing that I've come across,
No, but Elizabeth, you are talking about some extreme people, but
yes,
like average,
I agree, but
like normal school children, they should know the consequence. It's just very difficult to teach them. Also, the parents, they are not prepared to listen and to learn from good practices.
One other central issue to this, I think, Elizabeth, is that in most cases, communications on the internet are not multimodal in the same way that human communications are. When we speak to each other, even here, we can see your facial expression, we can hear the tone of your voice. We can get a lot more because there's video and audio involved when we are discussing something. So there's more social mores, if you like.
That's right.
That tend to push us in the direction of civil discourse. That's not the case for Twitter. It's not the case for Facebook. It's not the case for any of the other social media platforms in general.
I mean, maybe there's an answer there in the sense that the communications that we have should be essentially audio. I think for some time now that ultimately we're going to lose the skills of, we don't need to type, we just speak. It's much faster and contains much more information, as you point out, Peter, than the mere typing.
Yeah.
So maybe a new platform would be principally audio based, maybe with the odd video link or whatever. I mean, we have the bandwidth now, I think, to do probably quite a lot in that respect.
Yeah, in fact, I'm working on that, Evan, with a genius friend of mine who believes that as far as business is concerned, and you could say the same thing for any topic, people should be more interested in conversations with the organization involved than they are in just receiving and exchanging information in the other means.
Yeah.
What he does about it is he has emotionally intelligent avatars that debate with you, assist you. They can be your assistant. One example he has is of a lady avatar helping a lady prepare for a job interview, testing her out how she does at a simulated interview and giving feedback. That kind of stuff, because the robot knows your state of mind, your emotional particulars and so on, that can read that from the screen. She can be a lot more human-like in that situation. It's a very interesting area. There's a lot of AI, and this is bleeding-edge research. We're beyond the edge here. But I think that's going to be where it's going to go eventually. We're working on it.
Well, it's a massive topic you've taken on, Elizabeth, and very, very important, I think.
Thank you.
Yes.
Interesting.
It's very interesting to talk to you. I've got some real insights.
And very interesting to see your final conclusions on this.
With the trouble with doing what's essentially grounded study is it goes all over the place, but it's so fascinating, and I am particularly interested in the extent to which you can educate and nurture people, and the extent to which you're fighting against some hardwired things that are very, very difficult to overcome. And I think social media has basically, as you said, Michelle, it's always been the same, but what social media has done is shone a light on it. We can mix with the broader range of people than we used to, and we're seeing things that rather horrify us sometimes, but they've probably always been there.
Yes, we have about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Do you have any advice?
Can I sorry?
I was just going to say, what would you like the outcome of your research to be in a productive sense, not in an intellectual sense, but in something that you could apply?
I think I'd like to understand the natures of the or have an insight into the nature of the problems. I can't go into neuroscience, but if I got a feeling that there's some of these, and I do, that some people really struggle to overcome their bad habits, if you like, then we could possibly develop ways to support people and children in education to have a better level of self-awareness. And also to understand that the fundamental point of politics, that ultimately it needs to involve you listening to, engaging with and persuading people with whom you might fundamentally disagree. That's the way it works. So it's better ways of achieving that, and I think it comes down to self-awareness for a lot of people.
But that then is totally going against our combative parliamentary system.
No, you can be combative and self-aware, can't you? And know thy enemy and know thyself. Was it, you know?
I think we start. I didn't start school till I was 10, so, and I had zero interest in anything. I just played about in the fields. Maybe we'll do that.
Yeah, good idea. I would also, just the very last thing I'd like to say, I'm always looking to interview people, so you, or if you know anybody else, you know, I'm always interested to speak to people in more depth. And thank you ever so much, because your insights have been really interesting.
Thank you. A lot to think about. I screenshotted some of your presentation. It's really what to think about. Thank you.
But Elizabeth, you can share the PowerPoint.
I can do, yes. I mean, it's a work in development, so don't, you know, publish it before my. I mean, it can be shared, but obviously it's part of my PhD in development.
No, it was for myself, just to reflect. And
yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
Could email you perhaps, or
yeah.
I would like to be interviewed. I'm very interested.
Really?
Yeah, in the brain, you know, the color of the brain,
we'll
and the psychological side of it. But I think that we are coming to the end now. Yes, and thank you very much for a very interactive discussion today. I hope that you get the thing out of it that you want, Elizabeth. And
thank you. Yes, very much so.
Thank Evan, Michelle, and Peter. I'll see you next week.